Hi, we enter into Act 7 today as Stephen is about to begin a speech in response to the Sanhedrin's question of are these things so? And it's the longest speech in all of Acts, and as we'll see in a moment, many scholars, especially those of an earlier generation, see it as the absolute center of Luke's 2-volume work in explaining the whole thing. But what exactly does it explain, and what exactly is it here for? So before we enter into it, let's look at some of the questions I went over in the introductory video to this unit of Acts 6 and 7, as you can see on the right side of the screen. And now we're down to questions 7 through 10. So today, one of the first questions that scholars tend to ask is, what kind of a speech is Stephen giving here? That is he defending himself against the charges, prosecuting his opponents, or both? And one of the questions there is, should we be looking for the answer in terms of various categories of Greco-Roman rhetoric? In other words, is the Hellenistic Israelite here, Stephen, to be seen somebody trained in Roman rhetoric, and that's the question? Or is it a kind of speech we see in the Hebrew Bible that has nothing to do with Greco-Roman rhetoric? Because whenever you think the Hebrew Bible was written, it was written before Greco-Roman rhetoric was dominant in Jerusalem. So that's something we're going to have to look at. What is the theme of Stephen's speech that holds it together? And that depends in part on whether we think it's defensive or offensive. But as I'll show you in a minute when we look at the shape and key words, I think it ought to be pretty clear there are two themes that hold this whole thing together. What do we make of the many parallels between Stephen after his speech and the Passion of Jesus? And we saw last time, I noted that the calling before the Sanhedrin initiated the parallels as shown by Keener, and I can bring that chart up here and you can see it again. And I won't try to answer that question until we get through the entire speech. And at the end of the speech, as you can see in verse 58, is what is the role of someone called a young man named Saul? So as we enter in our passage, let's look at the interesting shape of it. It's not chiastic, but it's thematic. And if I go back out, you can see there's this Abraham section we'll look at today. Then there's no Isaac or Jacob section or anything about any of that. There's the Joseph section. Then it jumps right to Moses, which makes sense. Moses follows right after Joseph. But look how long the Moses section is. This about Moses, but this continues to be about the entire Exodus story. And then it jumps from the Exodus story to the question of the tent of the wilderness, tent of testimony in the wilderness, then replaced by the temple. And the entire monarchy seems left out of the entire story. Joshua is mentioned, David is mentioned, but not anything about David being king, simply about the dwelling place for God. And that's so that's one theme here. The people of Israel seem to consistently reject the people that God sent to them. That Abraham wasn't sent to them. Abraham is the one who establishes it. But Joseph is rejected by his brothers, at least at first. Moses is rejected by the people, and even God is rejected in the desert. That sets up the second theme, which is that God does not dwell in the houses made with human hands. And as I noted previously, we'll see that echo further into the story in Ephesus in chapter 19, where the issue is very similar, the question of the economic relationship with this temple that appears to be simply about worshiping a god, or in that case a goddess, but is economic through and through. And then finally, Stephen comes around and accuses his audience of being just like their ancestors, which leads to him getting killed. Not a great outcome. Although it may be one, he becomes a martyr and he becomes a model in many ways. So it's certainly an outcome that Stephen wasn't trying at all to avoid and certainly knew it was leading to. Let's look at how his speech compares to the speech of Paul to the Israelites in Antioch in chapter 13. Antioch, as we'll see, is one of the major centers for the development of this movement. And you can see, first of all, if I scroll out, you can see that Stephen's speech is way longer. Look how much longer it is. And what I've highlighted in color here, in black, are simply the people I call upon. So as I was just noting, Abraham, Joseph, Moses. But in Paul's speech, there's no mention of anybody from Genesis at all. It jumps right to Egypt, then to Samuel, and then to David. And then it jumps right to John the Baptist and Jesus. Whereas look how much more Stephen has on the Hebrew Bible here, and how much more Paul has about Jesus, making this speech in many ways parallel to Peter's speech, and we'll compare that when we get there as well. There are only a few things in common, and that's color-coded in the other ways. So we see the mention of 40 years in the wilderness in both of them. We see a question of the prophets. In Paul's speech, we hear him say, "Beware, therefore, that what the prophet said does not happen to you." And then we see, which of the prophets did your ancestors not persecute? But that's all they have in common there. Then we also see in common a very small piece that in Stephen's speech, it refers to the nations that God drove out before our ancestors. And in Paul's speech, similarly, after God, had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan. So it has some sense of them being foreigners in the land, but there's almost nothing in common in these two speeches. And that has everything to do with themes that we've been looking at throughout, which is to say narrative context. They're speaking to different people in different places. Stephen's speaking to the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem in the face of the Synagogue of the Freedman's challenge, and Paul in Antioch is speaking in a very different context, which we'll look at when we get there. Certainly we can see just for a moment where Antioch was up here compared to here. It's just north of the land, so there's not a surprise that there'd be a lot of Israelites in that land. Far different from Paul going out into the very distant places where it's a long farther way from Jerusalem. So let's put our keywords and right back up, and we'll jump right into our immediate scene here, starting in verse 1. And as we do, let's look some elements that I have are notes from what scholars have done in this chapter that we need to move beyond. I've been noting in the introductory video and throughout chapter 6 if some of the many issues of bad theology or old interpretations that were anti-Jewish in many ways, and we still see some of that in Stephen's speech. And so let's just, rather than my summarizing, let's just look at a few quotes. So you can see, first of all, I was just noting all these different speeches that are in the Hebrew Bible that suggest we don't have to go to Greco-Roman forms of rhetoric to understand the speech. Moses in Deuteronomy and Joshua in Joshua, Yahweh tells Ezekiel to make a speech there, and Nehemiah there, and the Psalms is simply the psalmist, understood perhaps as David. As Fitzmyer, expressing the older view, says, the beginning of Luke's account of the break of Christianity from his Jewish matrix. But Penner and others, here quoted from Keener, radically challenged, and as Keener says, an anti-Jewish reading of the Stephen narrative runs counter to Luke's narrative as a whole. And I really want to highlight that, because if you just pick up a commentary off the shelf in the library, whether at your church or in an academic library, you may well find that Luke and Acts are anti-Jewish, but nothing could be further from the kind. That's a radical misreading of the story, assuming, as I was saying earlier, from Protestant German scholars, but also from others, that Luke's point is to have the replacement of Judaism with Christianity, even though Christianity is never once mentioned in the entire book. So let's continue down to look at a few other points. Witherington notes the parallels with Jesus' trial, similarly to the one from Keener, so a number of scholars note that. As Walton notes, he says, strikingly, there is no evidence in the speech of a later Gentile Christian perspective. And that's why I want to highlight that we really don't need to look at Greco-Roman forms of rhetoric. We can just see how this parallels the very people that he's talking about here, including Moses. And this is where Luke Johnson makes his point. And Luke Johnson has been a great scholar over a long period of time, and yet more recent scholars suggest he's off on this point. So he says here, it is in Stephen's speech that we find most clearly articulated not only our author's interpretation of the biblical story, but also his understanding of how that story is continued in Jesus and the apostles. Stephen's speech is, as a whole, the key Luke provides his readers for the interpretation of his entire 2-volume work. But that requires a little more to know what does Johnson think the interpretation of the 2-volume work is. So let's look a little more. He says Luke is working very much like a Hellenistic historian when he has Stephen deliver a history lesson at this critical moment, a point that I just showed is not necessary at all. But following that line, he says, Luke was up to a similar task as his fellow apologists, like Philo, Josephus, and the Qumranists, but the claims he was defending were distinctive. Like Paul in Galatians and Romans, like the author of Hebrews and James, like Clement and Barnabas and Justin, Luke seeks to legitimate the messianic appropriation of Torah by showing how Torah itself demanded such an appropriation. But is that what he's doing at all? There's almost no mention of Torah in this entire speech as a unit, and certainly no issue of dispute over the law and suggesting that Jesus is doing something separate from the law. What he's doing something separate from is the temple, not the law. So I would take strong issue with Johnson on that. The speech may well be the center, but not because of a messianic appropriation of Torah. That's just a given, that as an Israelite, Torah belongs to the people. He continues further and therefore says, therefore, we are better able to understand what he means when he says that, quote, Moses and all the prophets contained the message that the Messiah had to suffer before entering his glory. And his reference to the road to Emmaus story in Luke 24 is certainly apt. In that story, that's what's at issue, because Jesus' disciples had not yet understood that the Messiah would not be one who would conquer like David, but would be one who suffered like Isaiah's suffering servant. But that's not the issue here. The issue is here, Stephen trying to convince the Synagogue of the Freedman that what they're doing now in establishing a different economic system, the temple, is justified. It has nothing to do with justifying the Messiah. It has everything to do with justifying the actions they're doing now. And so And further on, you see other notes there about it being a question of offensive or defensive following Witherington's attempt to structure it according to Greco-Roman rhetoric. And Witherington does that in his commentaries on Paul, for example, in Corinthians, and there it makes perfect sense, because Paul, writing in Corinth, is certainly trying to show his very Gentile audience in Corinth that he's trained in the kind of training they would be trained in. But that's not who Stephen's talking to. He's talking to a synagogue, and they would not necessarily be impressed by his training in Greco-Roman rhetoric. They're much more impressed that he can quote Scripture, even though they think he's being blasphemous, or at least that's the false charge they hold against him that we saw in the last scene. So that's some of the things to set it up. With that being said, let's just jump right in. Notice the high priest here is separate from what we saw a few verses earlier, that many of the priests joined. There it was described not as the way, but the faith. But they're certainly joining this community and now separated out from the high priest. And that's just another one of the highlights. This has nothing to do with Jews versus Christians or Judaism versus Christianity. It has to do with a split on the inside where the elite side with the status quo that supports them. And the people that are not served by the status quo, not surprisingly, are attracted to people like Jesus. So he asked them, are these things so? Asking a wide open question about the false charges that the witnesses that were bribed by the Synagogue of the Freedman representatives have brought before the Sanhedrin. And Stephen begins his speech this way. As Willie Jennings notes, his accusers saw him as dangerous, and they were right. Stephen has become a storyteller. There is no more powerful embodied reality in the world than a storyteller. And then Keener adds, contrary to anachronistic perspectives argued from the vantage point of later Christian anti-Semitism, Luke does not present Stephen's speech as anti-Jewish, just highlighting the largely uniform view of more recent scholarship in the last 20 years, refuting the earlier scholarship that this whole book was anti-Jewish. So Stephen addresses them in a triple male perspective here. Brothers and fathers, but men brothers and fathers, as you can see on the right side there. And I highlight that because you see fathers as a key theme throughout. And he's appealing them literally man to man, suggesting that they're both his brothers, they're members of the same family of Israel, but also the fathers as the Sanhedrin, which is certainly would have been largely respected, if not feared, by ordinary people, something like the Supreme Court in the United States, if the United States was occupied by a foreign empire. So he's respecting them right away and trying to appeal to them at first by honoring who they are, but then he demands, listen to me. We saw Peter say to the Israelites, listen as well, and we'll see Paul in that same speech say, listen. So listen to me, and here he goes. The God of glory, this is what he starts with. And note how that follows, if I just go back a couple verses, with what their experience was, his face was like the face of an angel. And even though we don't know what the face of an angel is like, we certainly saw Luke portray Jesus like Mark and Matthew does at the transfiguration on the top of the mountain, with a face whiter than any human bleacher could bleach it. And that would certainly be the sense of that it's glorious, that it's shining, that it's bright. And so the God of glory who had just been appeared to Stephen, now Stephen says, appeared to our father Abraham. The phrase God of glory is only in Psalm 29, or it's in Psalm 29, it's only here in the New Testament. And Psalm 29 themes of God's powerful voice and enthronement are key. I won't go back and look at the whole business of it, but it certainly highlights that the Creator is enthroned and doesn't need a house. And that's establishing that right at the beginning, but we'll frame with it at the end. So he appeared using horao 30 times in Luke Acts, and especially Luke afterward, which has to do with an appearance. Fitzmyer notes that this version of the call of Abraham fits that current in Luke's contemporary Judaism, which is to say from the Septuagint. This entire speech is framed by glorious appearances, and we'll see it's one of several frames, even though it's not a chiasm overall. And notice our, to our ancestor, first of 12 times in Stephen's speech, and you can see in the light blue, our, trying to highlight that he's with them. And it's just another one of the elements that there's nothing anti-Jewish here. He is an Israelite, and he's appealing to his fellow Israelites about their father Abraham. Notice there's no sense of creation, the beginning and the primeval history story, but jumping right there. Keener notes how many other Jewish writers adapted Abraham to fit their own time and needs, most more so than Luke does here. When he was in Mesopotamia, interestingly, mentioned in chapter 2 of people from Mesopotamia that came from the Pentecost experience, but it's curiously not used in the Torah, Septuagint, except in Deuteronomy 23, outside the story of the patriarchs. It's only one other time elsewhere in the Bible, similarly to Chaldeans that we'll see in the next verses. So, when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran, according to Genesis 11:31, he had already settled in Haran when Abraham heard this voice. This in Mesopotamia underscored from the beginning God's presence beyond the temple. And there's no sense of the father settled in Haran, Terah here. He leaves out that altogether, as if it was just Abram's doing. There's also no mention of Sarai at that time either. So it's a more patriarchal speech than even the Genesis text has. And then Yahweh said to him here, and it's modified here from the Septuagint, which omits, Stephen's speech omits the phrase, from your father's house, the triple leaving. Leave your land, your kindred, and your father's house. In the Septuagint version that Luke excises here in Stephen's speech, it's leave the earth, and that's 10 of 33 times in this speech. So I highlighted it that way, even though sometimes it sounds like it should be land, and so we see earth 5 times in this immediate phrase here. So leave the earth that you're a part of, and your kindred here, using sungenia, and you can see Genesis and genes like genealogy and with there. So the family members who you're with, it's only here in verse 14 in one other time in the New Testament. And go to the land that I will show you. Again, leaving out your father's house. So then he left. He left the country of the Chaldeans. That's simply land as well there. I didn't put a note on it, but that's what we see there. And you can see it on the right side. The Chaldeans is only here in the New Testament. It's echoing the Septuagint of the scene that's being quoted here in 11, 28, and 31 in Genesis, and then again in 15:7 during the scene at night when God says to Abraham, anticipating the Exodus there. And it's not elsewhere in the Torah or the Deuteronomistic history until the very end of 2 Kings. So Stephen is really reaching in to use that word here. Whether that word would make sense to his audience is certainly anachronistic in this time period. And settled in Haran, koitakeo here, meaning someone who settles, but also an inhabitant of a place, following the Septuagint as well. But then we have something very different than the Septuagint, leaving and the Hebrew for that matter, leaving Terah out of the story other than mentioned here, because it says in our verse, after his father died, God had him move from there to this country. But plainly, according to the story, Terah lived 70 years after Abraham left Haran. So it meant in the story, we had Abraham taking Lot and leaving his father in Haran. But in this version, his father has died first. Certainly, Stephen knows the text. He's saying that to take away any sense that Abraham might have done something bad in abandoning his father in that land. So God had him move from there, or literally moved him. I didn't change it in the translation, but you can see that there. From there to this country in which you are now living. Highlighting, as my note has, including the audience within the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham and calling them to trust in God's later promises, according to Cradle. Let's go down to finish our passage here in just a few verses here. So, notice it starts negative here. He doesn't go into the details of the story of anything of Abraham's struggles, but goes to the negative part simply about the land. So he did not give him any of it as a heritage here. Kleronomion here, echoing Genesis 15:7. And notes the recall of Luke 20:14 with the Sanhedrin as the wicked tenants. And we can see that back here. This is the heir, let us kill him. But in this case, Abraham is not the heir in that sense. And using an unusual phrase here, didn't give him any, not even a foot's length, but the word for length is bema, which is usually a beam, a judicial bench. So a foot bench, something like that. I don't know it as a phrase otherwise, but we see bema in these other places every time as a judicial bench. So it's an interesting figure of speech there, obviously highlighting none of the land, but promised to give it to him as his possession. Now let's look at possession here, literally into taking, fulfilled at 7:45. We'll see later in the speech. And to his descendants, or literally to his seed, even though he had no child yet. You'd think he had no child at all at that point. And continuing on, and notice how everything that it's leaving out of the Abraham story, it's leaving out the Hagar business, it's leaving out the Akedah, the almost sacrifice, and all the other struggles, the wife-sister stories, to just highlight this relationship with the land. So this is citing from Genesis 15. And God spoke in these terms that his seed would be resident aliens, paroikon, contrasting with the settling we saw just in a couple verses before, in a country belonging to others. Alotria here, only here in Acts, and it's 14 times in the New Testament. So notice the various relationships there being resident aliens, the land belonging to others, or settled, all about the question of the relationship with the land. Not mentioning Egypt yet, but obviously Egypt will be mentioned many times starting in the very next scene. And that's why I really want to highlight that this works not as chiasms, but as these paragraphs that highlight different key words along the way. So predicting they would end up in Egypt where they would be mistreated or injured, as in 7:19. Notice how a number of words are echoed into later places into the speech, but again, not chiastically. But finally, God says, I will judge the nation they serve, and after that they shall come out and worship me in this place. Now notice the ambiguity of worship me in this place. This place from Deuteronomy often refers to the temple anticipating it and to Jerusalem anticipating it, because in the story world of Deuteronomy, they're not anywhere near Jerusalem yet, and they don't necessarily know the city that's described as a city on which Yahweh will put his name. But so here, this audience could hear this as worship me in this place, meaning in the Jerusalem temple, but that's not what he means. He simply means in the land. The word for worship here is replacing Genesis 15:4 with many possessions with an adapted version of Exodus 3:12. And the word for worship, latrososin, here is ironically echoed at Acts 7:42 below, as we'll see. Notice the number of words, about half a dozen we've seen in these first verses that are echoed in various places later in the chapter, in the speech. And then one more verse and we'll complete the Abraham unit here, jumping to chapter 17. In Genesis. Then he gave him the covenant of circumcision. And certainly the point of that isn't about circumcision. The point of that is about covenant, about this relationship between God and the people. That's still in effect, and certainly no sense that this has been abandoned. There's no sense, as sometimes Paul is read when he says that people who want to circumcise Gentiles in order to make them part of the community of Jesus, he wishes the knife would slip and they'd castrate themselves. But this is not about others. This is simply about Israel, what joins the Israelite men together through this covenant of circumcision. And that leads to fatherhood. And notice how it's all the patriarchal sequences in less than one verse. And so Abraham became the father of Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac became the father of Jacob. Doesn't say he had him circumcised. And Jacob of the 12 patriarchs. And that's it. Literally, if you look at my note below, there's no verb there. Literally, and Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob, the 12 patriarchs. Jumping right through the rest of the Genesis story, because Joseph will be the one he wants to focus on, because they were jealous of Joseph. And that's what we'll take up next time at the second part of Stephen's speech. See you then. Bye-bye.